So you're probably aware that the Braves won their division title and made the playoffs again this year. I mean, we've come to expect that of them. But I'm old enough to remember when we had very different expectations for our Atlanta baseball team. For a long time, you could count on them being near the bottom of the standings every year. Now that changed back in the 1990s when they started their long run of success. And it was in one of those early years in that run, I think it was probably about 1993. The Giants were in first place in the Braves division. And it was right at the halfway mark of the season. Well, my dad had been listening to all the experts talk about how many games the Braves would have to win in the second half of the season and how many the Giants would have to lose. And he claimed that the Braves didn't have a chance of winning the division that year. Well, I couldn't believe it. I mean, the season was just halfway over. There were 80 games left to play. I tried to tell him that anything could happen. You couldn't just write off a good team with so many games still left to play. And as it turned out, I was right. On the last day of the season that year, the Braves won their division. And so when I talked to my dad later, he said he was having a hard time talking, that he was having to get the shoe leather out of his mouth. And maybe we've been guilty of sticking our foot in our mouth too at times, because we tend to do the same thing with people. We write them off, give up on them. Maybe we consider that person to be somebody who just won't amount to anything, or at least someone whom God can't help or can't use. We write them off when God hasn't written them off yet. And not only do we do that with other people, but sometimes we even write ourselves off like that. God can't help me. He can't do much with me. I can't amount to much spiritually. He can't use me. Yet the Lord may have a special purpose for that other person or for you. If we'll just give that person a chance, give ourselves a chance, or give God a chance to work. Well, such was the case of a fellow in the Old Testament named Jephthah. We find the account of his life in Judges chapter 11. And as we look at it, we find that he was someone who was written off by others, seemingly even written off by himself. But he was chosen by God. So let's read just a few verses here to help us to get somewhat of an idea of what was going on. We'll begin at verse 1 of Judges chapter 11. Now Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty man of valor, but he was the son of a harlot. And Gilead begot Jephthah. Gilead's wife bore sons, and when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah out and said to him, "You shall have no inheritance in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman." Then Jephthah fled from his brothers and dwelt in the land of Tob. And worthless men banded together with Jephthah and went out raiding with him. It came to pass after a time that the people of Ammon made war against Israel. And so it was when the people of Ammon made war against Israel that the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the land of Tob. Then they said to Jephthah, "Come and be our commander, that we may fight against the people of Ammon." Then if you'll skip on down to verse 32. So Jephthah advanced toward the people of Ammon to fight against them, and the Lord delivered them into his hands. And he defeated them from Aroer as far as Minnith, 20 cities, and to Abel Keramim with a very great slaughter. Thus the people of Ammon were subdued before the children of Israel. So notice there in verse 1 that Jephthah was described as a mighty man of valor. Now that phrase you'll find used at times in the Old Testament in several places to describe someone who was one of the best of the soldiers or one of the best of the fighting men. Someone who is especially courageous and capable in military matters. That's what many of the so-called judges actually were. They were military leaders. You remember that this was the time in Israel's history when they followed this particular cycle. First they would turn away from the Lord and worship other gods. Then the Lord would allow some other nation to come in and conquer them for a time. Then eventually the Israelites would turn back to God, and He'd end up raising up a judge or a deliverer, someone to rescue them from those oppressors. But then after a while, what would happen? They'd turn away from God again, and that cycle would repeat itself. So at this time we're reading about here, they were in that part of the cycle where the Israelites were being oppressed by the Ammonites. But they had started seeking God, turning back to Him. And they were looking for God to provide someone to lead them and rescue them from these Ammonites. And that's where Jephthah enters the picture. He was a brave fighting man. He seemed like a good candidate to lead the people. But there was one problem. He had already been written off by his family and his friends. Although in verse 1, as we read, it states that Jephthah was a mighty man of valor, it adds the word but. You ever do that, talking about somebody? Well, he's a good guy, but, or she's got a lot of talent, but, it indicates that there was a problem. Jephthah was a mighty man of valor. He had the potential to be a great leader and someone who could help the Israelites. But it says there, he was the son of a harlot. And as the other sons of Gilead grew up and realized what that meant, that Jephthah was only a half-brother, they drove him away, not wanting him to have any part in their inheritance. So, maybe greed played a part in this too. But they virtually disowned him as a member of the family. And there's no indication that they did this because of anything Jephthah had done or because of any flaw in his character. It was just because of something he couldn't help, something that he had no control over, something his parents had done. So they wrote him off as worthless, as someone to keep away from. I'm afraid sometimes we do the same thing. We may not drive people away, but there are certain individuals that we keep our distance from, or we don't welcome them like we do others, or maybe even we don't pray for them like we do others because we consider them a hopeless case. Maybe we don't believe they really belong in God's family or that they can come to possess part of our inheritance in Christ. Maybe because of their background or their social class or their skin color, their past life, or their age, either their very young age or their very old age. We write them off as having no part in God's true kingdom or as being able to have little or no part in God's plans and purposes. We write them off, even though God may not have, and even though He may even have a special purpose for them if only they were given the opportunity. So let's be careful about writing people off too easily, judging them by their appearance or their background, and concluding that they're a hopeless case when it comes to God working in them or through them. Or I don't know, maybe you're someone that others have written off at some point, or that others have given up on. Or maybe they did at one time. Maybe there were those who thought God couldn't do much for you or do much in your life, or that maybe He can at this point in your life. Maybe because of your age, that your best years are behind you and God can't work through you now. And what we really have to be careful of is what seems to have happened to Jephthah. Because it's especially sad when people, maybe influenced by the opinions of others, end up writing themselves off. And it seems that Jephthah may have done that. In verse 3, we see that he fled from his brothers, and he went to live in another place, the land of Tob, which I understand was in Syrian territory. Now, no doubt, he was hurt over his brother's actions, and he may have thought, maybe they're right. I am just the son of a harlot. If they think I'm useless and no good, maybe they're right. Maybe I am. So he ran off into a nearby foreign territory. And it says there that a gang of worthless men gathered around Jephthah. And that word worthless probably indicates that they were the poor, maybe what we'd call the down and out, social outcast. So they hung out together and apparently, raided some of the surrounding areas. So even there we see Jephthah's leadership and his military skills were recognized and being put to use, but not in the best way. It seems that Jephthah had given up on himself and settled for being chief of the down and outers, leader of the worthless ones as far as society was concerned and how they looked at his activities and those people that he associated with. It's sad when people give up on themselves, especially in relation to the Lord. Maybe they begin to believe others who consider them to be hopeless. Or maybe they just listen to the wrong voices in their own heads. And maybe they can't forgive themselves for some things that they did in the past. Or they have a hard time believing that God really loves them and wants them and could really help them and could use somebody of their background, somebody with their past, somebody with their limitations, somebody with those skeletons in their closet. They have a hard time believing that God can love them, can forgive them, and change them, and make them new, and use someone like them in His service or in the work of His kingdom in some way. They give up on themselves and settle for being spiritual down and outers. They reconcile themselves to the idea that they're worthless as far as doing any kind of meaningful service for the Lord. Maybe because of things from the past, or maybe just because of the stage of life that we're in as we get older, or because of certain limitations in our present circumstances. And that's sad. It's sad to give up on ourselves when God hasn't. It's sad to believe that we're worthless when God values us, when He cares about us, when He has a special place just for us and a work for us to do. And that was the case with Jephthah. God had chosen him and had a special work for him to do, even though his family had written him off, even though it seems he may have given up on himself to some extent. God chose to raise him up as the next judge and deliverer for Israel for this particular time in their history. In verse 4, it indicates that some time passed after Jephthah was kicked out of his hometown, and some new fighting and conflict started up between the Ammonites and Israel. So the folks in Gilead remembered what a good soldier Jephthah had been. So they went to Tob. Maybe they were humbly eating their shoe leather at this point. They were asking him to come back. It seems that they no longer cared if he was the son of a harlot or not. They needed his leadership. They needed his military experience. They needed his skills. So they told him if he'd come back, they'd make him their leader, their ruler, their president more or less. So he agreed to do it. But the implication of this whole account isn't just that Jephthah ended up being chosen by the people, but that God was working out His will through all of this, and that He had chosen Jephthah for this work. On back in chapter 10, verse 15, it refers to how the people had repented of their sins, how they had put away all their false gods and prayed to the Lord for deliverance. And it says of God, His soul could no longer endure the misery of Israel. He felt compassion for His people. So what did He do? He answered their prayers by raising up Jephthah to be their deliverer. That's when it goes into this account of Jephthah, showing that he was the answer to their prayers from God. We see further evidence that Jephthah was God's choice later on. In chapter 11, verse 29, when they were heading out to battle, it says that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him. In verse 32, it says that as they fought, the Lord delivered the Ammonites into his hand. The Lord helped him and used him. He was God's chosen man for this occasion. Jephthah's background and heritage wasn't perfect. He was the son of a harlot, but he was chosen and used by God. Now, we might be more comfortable with the circumstances surrounding the birth of, someone like Samson, one of the other judges of Israel. You remember an angel appeared to his mom and dad, informing them that they were going to have a son who would begin to deliver the Israelites from the Philistine. That was, more of a holy, sacred scene with an angel involved there. But Jephthah, he was born out of an unholy, adulterous relationship. But God still chose him. And I dare say that none of us come from perfect backgrounds, do we? None of our past are ideal in every way. We probably have our skeletons in our closet. Maybe we have some of our relatives that we'd just as soon not talk about or not introduce to anyone. We have things that have happened to us in the past or things that we've done that we'd like to forget. Things that might cause others to look down on us. Things that might make us question how God could choose to love me or to work in my life or to use me in His work or to make me into somebody that's fit for heaven. But you know, it seems that God often tends to choose people that we wouldn't. Mama's boy Jacob, back in the book of Genesis. Moses, who couldn't speak well. Or baby brother David, who, remember, was out tending the sheep while his brothers were being looked over as possible candidates to be the next king. And then Jephthah, the son of a harlot. I can say with certainty this morning that God's chosen you. Now, I may not be able to foresee all that God's chosen you for, the specific things, but from the authority of God's word, I can tell you this. He's chosen you to be saved from your sin. He's called whosoever will to come, and that includes you. He's called you to become a child of God, and He's called you to be His ambassador, one of His representatives and His servant on this earth throughout the rest of your life. Regardless of whether you're the son of a harlot, the daughter of a moonshiner, a preacher's kid, or whatever else is in your background or past, God loves you, and He has a special place in His kingdom just for you. So don't write yourself off as being hopeless spiritually or as being worthless in God's service. A little girl was born with major health problems that left her crippled and confined to leg braces. And no doubt some people wrote her off as never going to be able to run and to play like other kids. But she never gave up on herself. And from what I understand, she believed in a God who could help her. Well, after secretly practicing with the help of her brothers and sisters, on her 12th birthday, she shocked her parents and doctors by removing her braces and walking around the doctor's office. She never wore those braces again. Then she wanted to play basketball. The coach agreed to it, mainly because he wanted to get her older sister on the team. But after much hard work, she became one of the best players. In a tournament, one of the referees was impressed by her and asked if she'd ever considered running track. Well, after basketball season ended, that's what she did, and she began to win some races. At age 16, so think that's just 4 years after removing those braces, she had become one of the country's best young runners. She went on to the Olympics, where she won a bronze medal for anchoring the 400-meter relay. 4 years later, at the next Olympics, she won the 100-meter dash, the 200-meter dash, and anchored the winning 400-meter relay team, all in record time. Wilma Rudolph, you might recognize her name. She capped off the year by being named the most outstanding amateur athlete in America. No, she didn't have a perfect background or a great beginning for an Olympic runner, but she didn't give up on herself or on God's ability to help her. And you may look at yourself this morning, your background, your past, or maybe even your present circumstances, and think it'll cripple you from ever being able to effectively run the Christian race. But it doesn't have to, and it won't unless you let it, because God's chosen you. He's chosen you to give you spiritual life, to live within you, and to do His will in this world through you, and over time, to make you more and more like Jesus. Wilma Rudolph won her gold medals, and Jephthah reached what we've come to call the Hall of Faith, the Bible's Hall of Fame for people of faith. I'm talking about that list of people of faith there in Hebrews chapter 11. In the midst of the names of the great people listed there who did great things by faith, people like Moses and Noah and David and Abraham, there are a couple of names that you might not expect. And one of those, it's Jephthah. Jephthah, the son of a harlot, but chosen and used by God. And you and I may never win any gold medals or reach any halls of fame, but no matter who you are, no matter where you've been, no matter where you've come from, and no matter where you may find yourself today, you can know the joy and peace of Jesus Christ living in your heart, and you can know the blessing of serving Him and being used by Him in the ways that He sees fit. You don't have to be a spiritual down and outer this morning. You're not hopeless, and you're not worthless in God's kingdom and in the work of His kingdom. He's chosen you, and He has a special place just for you in His kingdom and in His service.